Greetings, everyone. This is Peter Costea, host of Voice of Christians, the English podcast. First of all, I want to apologize because we are starting sort of late because of some technical issues on my side, and we apologize for that. But we are very happy to have Professor Baker with us today. We're going to have a fantastic conversation today about a very interesting topic. Actually, I should say a number of topics which combine form an excellent book which Professor Baker has published earlier in the year. I apologize. I want to say welcome to Dr. Baker to our show, to our podcast. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Baker, in the United States. I'm in Brussels right now, and our technician is in Romania. So good evening to everybody in Europe, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody in the United States, and whoever is going to watch this podcast. I also want to thank Voice of Christians Romania because you're allowing us either Friday night or Saturday night to use their platform to also launch these interviews and podcasts in the English language, which we find very useful, especially for the young Romanian evangelicals, especially or Catholics who live abroad and who understand English much better than they understand Romanian for a variety of reasons. Nothing unusual about that in the global age. So we appreciate very much Dr. Baker being with us here to discuss very serious topics, folks. I usually say when I have a broadcast or a podcast in English, I always say this platform is for relevant and intelligent conversations. And I think that you're going to see this evening or this afternoon that we are going to have that conversation with Dr. Baker. We are going to talk about the faith, the role of faith in the public square, in politics. He published a book which I'm going to focus on today about postliberal Protestants, Baptists in between Obergefell and Christian nationalism. 5 or 6 topics encompassed in this formidable, phenomenal title of this book, which he published earlier today. And actually, I did get a call from someone, Dr. Baker, today actually asking me whether or not we are going to translate his book into Romanian. And I might want to talk with you about that after this podcast, because again, the concepts we're going to discuss today are very important, very contemporary and actual for everybody, for every Christian, which needs to educate himself and herself in the important topics of the day. I want to let you know, folks, that you're in good hands today. I'm in good hands. You're in good hands with Dr. Baker, because concerning issues of separation of church and state, issues concerning faith in the public square, issues concerning Christian nationalism, social norms, Christian values, Dr. Baker is an expert. I also want to let you know that Dr. Baker is one of the most educated people that I have ever met in life. He has a PhD in politics and religion from the from Baylor University in the state of Texas, and he also has a Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Houston. Dr. Baker, you're an amazing person, highly educated. We do have at least these two things together, or 3 things together. I live in Houston, but not in Brussels. I went to the University of Houston and got my JD degree at the University of Houston, and I also have a PhD, and just like you, I am a Christian, and I strongly believe in the place of faith in the public square. So, Professor Baker, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself to us and our audience. Tell us a few things about yourself, your background, where you teach, and then we'll get into the phenomenal topics that we have lined up for today.
Well, I went to college at Florida State University, which is where I became a Christian, basically through the reading of an author named Peter Costea, where through his work I came to believe that the resurrection was real, that Christ was actually resurrected. And from there, I would say that my Christian worldview began to take shape through the work of C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer, and eventually found that while I wanted to work in the areas of politics and public policy and law, I also wanted to be involved in higher education and wanted to try to shape young people through that kind of work. And that's where I am now. Now, with regard to my time in law school, I went to law school in my late 20s. I graduated University of Houston in 2000. I don't know what year you might have come out. When did you
I
graduate?
Yeah, I graduated from the University of Houston Law School with my JD degree in May of 1990.
Okay, okay. Um, while I was there, I spent both summers working on religious liberty issues in Virginia and in the Washington, D.C. area, and gained basically what has become a lifelong passion for religious liberty. And that has really taken me on the path that I'm on now. And I've written 4 books: The End of Secularism, Political Thought, A Student's Guide, The System Has a Soul, and now Postliberal Protestants.
Fascinating, and you're also very active on social media. You're doing a lot of podcasts. And again, we thank you very much for honoring us with your presence. I also taught for about a year. I taught at the university. I taught at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa a long, long time ago. Gave up teaching, so I decided that I'm going to jump on and practice law in Houston for a while. And now I commute between Houston and Brussels doing legal work, most of the United States, but now for the last couple of months in Brussels as well. Professor Baker, you have written a fundamental book. I'm seeing the title of your book just about every other day or so, more often also in the summer, because you published a phenomenal book. And I'm going to ask Janina, she's our technician from Romania tonight. She's helping us from Romania. If you don't mind, Janina, go ahead and put on the screen the title of the book. The title of the book is Post-Liberal Protestants, Baptists between Obergefell and Christian Nationalism. So there you go, folks. Whoever is watching this podcast, I encourage each and every one of you to buy the book. I already bought it. I admit I have not finished reading it. I'm in Brussels. The book is still in Houston. But I recommend to all of you to buy the book. If you are interested in post-liberalism, you will find ideas as to what that is. If you're interested in, Baptists and Obergefell and other notions that might be alien to people who don't actually live in the United States or are fluent in American politics, you will learn a lot from this book. So, Dr. Baker, what really jumped to my eyes, what sort of woke me up like from a slumber, when I saw the title of the book and I saw the interview which you had about your book with Dr. Micah Watson from, I think, Calvin University in the United States, which was published in Public Discourse, I said, wow, the title just jumped at me. And so I've got to confess, I'm a Baptist, I'm an evangelical, and so when I saw that the name Baptist appears in the book, in the title of the book, I thought about asking you the first question or the first couple of questions about the title of the book. For those of us who do not know that much about Baptists or so, can you tell us more or less a little bit about who they are, their history, and why their name is in the title of your book?
Yeah, so Baptists to me are the kind of the pioneers of the free church tradition. You have the Catholic Church for a very, very long time that operates in such a way as that there is a close alliance with the state. Lots of questions as to who dominates, the Pope or a king or something like that. But basically, to be born is to be baptized and to become a member of the political community at the same time. It's just sort of an automatic sort of a thing. The shorthand for that would be to call that the comprehensive church. Everyone is in, right? It doesn't really matter what their volition is. They're in. Whereas Baptists have always fought for what I would call the regenerate church, which is the idea of the church of believers and believers only. And so children are not baptized when they're born. Instead, you're looking for them to reach some sort of a suitable age, at which time they'll make a decision for Christ and be baptized. And there's a lot to that, right? I mean, that view of the church leads to various consequences. There is a lot of new interest in the idea of the comprehensive church. You see that in a lot of these sort of people in the United States writing about Christian nationalism, or you might think about Catholic integralism, those sorts of things. But my argument is that that approach to the church actually weakens the church, innervates the church, and that when we look at the places in the world that have pursued that comprehensive church model, those are really the most secular places in the world, namely Western Europe.
You're absolutely right about that. And in terms of the Baptists, for those who do not know, they appeared sort of out of nowhere in the 17th century, if I'm correctly remembering history, and they started to preach and write and teach on some of the topics that we're going to discuss tonight. Am I right about that?
Right. They're sort of an offshoot of the Puritans.
Who settled New England initially.
Right. Right.
It's interesting because you also mentioned the Catholic approach to this whole subject that you're going to discuss tonight, and you talked about the approach that's called integralism, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Right.
And actually, I came across a book review that was published a couple of months ago on the topic, and I was going to ask you about that topic as well. The Catholic doctrine or Catholic social thought concerning politics that at the base, at the foundation of political society or secular society ought to be Catholic thinking, social thinking, pursuit of the common good, with the notion of common good being defined by Catholic Church, defined by the Catholic Church and the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church. Am I right about that?
Well, yeah, I think that is right. Now, as I say this, I don't want to sound like that I am deeply critical of the Catholic Church. It's just that I have a particular idea as to what's the right relationship between church and state. And I would argue that the Catholic Church in the 20th century really moved a lot closer to the Baptist position. In the 20th century, the Catholic Church really stopped seeking to be the exclusive church of a political community. You can look at the work of an American like John Courtney Murray, arguing that Catholics should embrace religious liberty. And I think that most Catholics have become convinced of that point of view. Catholic integralism, I think, would mean kind of going back to that older view.
Right. And you also mentioned something that is really, from an empirical point of view, and observation shows us, like Aristotle says in his Politics, that indeed, when you look at the traditional Catholic countries like Spain or Italy or France, these are highly secularized states where the influence of religion in society is virtually nil. And on the other hand,
Right.
and we'll also talk about the Protestants hopefully later on today, where also the church has, in a sense, become a tool or a vehicle, a vector for the promotion of political ends and the political doctrine of the day, which is secularism, which is very unfortunate. You're talking about Scandinavia, you're talking about some extent, you're talking about Germany, maybe Holland as well. Another thing that caught my attention in the title of your book is the first word in the title. That's post-liberal Protestants. Most of us, of course, know who the Protestants are. But what is, for those of us who don't have that much of that much knowledge about post-liberalism. What is post-liberalism, and why did you choose this term for your book?
Sure. So I have to start by talking about liberalism. Now, a lot of times, if we're talking about liberalism, people think that we mean the left, right? Left wing liberalism. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about liberalism more broadly. So, as an example, the Cold War came to an end, roughly 1989, 1990, right about there. And at that point, there was a great American political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, who said, "This is the end of history." Right? And what he meant by that was that we're not going to argue about the big questions anymore, but instead, everybody will be operating under political liberalism. And the way to define political liberalism is that we have limited government. We have at least some form of democracy. We have constitutional rights such as religious liberty and freedom of speech, those sorts of things. And that would become the frame for everyone, for all modern people. That would be the expectation. So when I talk about post-liberal, I'm talking about people who have rejected the idea that liberalism is sort of the framework for all of us, and that they want to and somehow go away from that sort of modern settlement. And what I'm trying to do is to convince people that no, the church can thrive within that sort of broad liberalism, and that we should retain it.
Right.
So to be post-liberal, to be post-liberal is to do things like so on the left and the right. On the left, you have people who want to reject things like freedom of speech. For example, in the United States, some people who are on the left will say freedom of speech is just a relic of white privilege, or something like that, or religious liberty is nothing more than a pretext for discrimination. So those would be post-liberals on the left. Post-liberals on the right want to do things like bring back the state church, and to impose a national faith, things of that nature.
Which obviously would be dangerous, which takes me to a very important aspect of our conversation, and that has to do with the label Obergefell in the title of your book. Again, you're putting in context and the relevance of the book for 2025. And I want to emphasize 2024, 2025, because the concepts that you're talking about are so, you hit the nail on the head, especially when you talk about Obergefell. You're talking about American jurisprudence and how it went astray, in my opinion, as a lawyer, and maybe in your opinion as a lawyer as well, in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, ever since the Roe versus Wade decision. Tell us, especially for the benefit of those who are not attorneys or do not live in the United States or have no knowledge of American politics or jurisprudence, tell us about Obergefell. It's the name of a person. If you can tell us about this title, this person, this label, and how this idea, person, name, topic fits into the title of your book.
Yeah, well, so you mentioned Roe v. Wade, and I think that probably almost anybody, if they hear the words Roe v. Wade, they think abortion, right? They think about the case that established a national right to abortion in the United States. Obergefell is the case that finally established that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right in the United States. And the reason that is particularly notable is because it's really a case that puts Christian orthodoxy directly at odds with the U.S. Constitution. And so then that raises all kinds of questions about things like religious liberty, right? If gay marriage is a constitutional right, And if you oppose gay marriage, are you essentially in the same position as a member of the KKK, right? Some sort of a high level racist or something like that. How do we treat the Christian believer in a post Obergefell world? So my point is that it creates a crisis. People on the left, and I write about this at length in the book. People on the left want to use Obergefell to essentially beat Christians into submission
Right.
legally, and people on the right react to Obergefell by saying, "Okay, that's it. We've had it. It's time to take the gloves off, and it's time to go back to the state church. It's time to be much more ambitious about how we're about our goals for Christianity politically, up to changing the type of legal regime in which we live." So that's really the fundamental tension is we see left post-liberalism and right post-liberalism, and I would argue that Obergefell is sort of a catalyst for both.
Yes, I think I understand your point, and I totally agree with it. And folks, for those of you who do not really understand the impact, which was very well explained by Dr. Baker, I want to add, Obergefell was a decision issued by the Supreme Court of the United States in June of 2015, 10 years ago, out of nowhere, out of the blue, after about 22, 23, 25 states in the United States, including Texas, I think South Carolina as well, adopted constitutional amendments at the state level prohibiting marriage between persons of the same sex. And then, lo and behold, after about 10, 15 years of these amendments going to the people, to we the people, and in different states in the United States, the Supreme Court of the United States torpedoes all of these constitutional amendments and says to maybe 100 people who voted in those referendums, your work was in vain. Your views don't matter. Your votes don't matter. What matters is what five people, like Justice Scalia said, what five people out of nowhere have in their heads, and they decide that marriage between one man and another man, a woman with another woman, from now on is going to be the law of the land. And of course, that was such an earth shattering decision. It was like an earthquake because, like you said, it dislocated the whole legal framework of the United States in the area of civil rights. It caused tremendous conflict between certain rights and this brand new, never known in history before, the right to gay marriage. You criticize gay marriage, you cannot. You cannot exercise your freedom of expression, freedom of speech, your religious freedom to criticize this, social uh, behavior or social aspect that's never been known in the history of mankind since the creation of the world. And I think you would agree with me that we have been fortunate after Obergefell that just about every decision issued by the Supreme Court of the United States, which pits gay rights versus religious freedom rights, usually the Supreme Court sides with religious freedom so far. So far. Has that been your impression
So
as
far,
well?
yeah.
Yeah, we've been a little fortunate in that regard. So, but folks, watch out. Those interested in religious freedom, watch out for these issues because so far we've been sort of lucky. But if politics change in the United States and the composition of the Supreme Court changes, then we might suffer some terrible consequences. Now, another thing that I want to cover with you about the title of your book still is you reference the ending two words of your book title is Christian nationalism. Of course, all of us know what nationalism is. Thank you again, Janina, for putting the cover of the book on the screen. Christian nationalism. What is Christian nationalism? Its origins, how does it manifest itself? What are the ideological roots and thinking behind this this label?
Yeah, so really, I think it's just the Protestant version of Catholic integralism. Really, those who make the argument, they look at the churches of what we would call the magisterial Reformation, the German church, the Lutherans, Calvin's church at Geneva. So Presbyterians, Lutherans, who the Church of England, for example, who embraced this idea of a national church, typically headed by the king, right? And in fact, those who argue for Christian nationalism today, many of them will be calling for a Christian prince. We need a Christian prince to sort of lead this thing, and just the idea again to return to a unified church and state, with the idea that they will be able to recapture the culture in this way.
Yeah, it's to some extent, I think it's a dangerous idea. Maybe you have a different opinion, but we certainly do not want to go back to Calvin's Geneva. We do not want to go back to the Anabaptist experiments from the 16th century, right, in Holland or in parts of Germany. We do not want to get back, to those historical times, and there is a danger in if you're not careful in thinking too much about going in that direction. What are the odds of anything like that actually happening in the United States? I don't think the odds are
Well,
any significant, but what do you think?
it's a good question. I think that the way the Christian nationalists are thinking about this kind of stuff is they're thinking kind of like the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks in Russia, I don't think that they were really a majority of people. I think that they were able to, through determined action of a minority, able to kind of capture the levers of power. And I think that that would be the way Christian nationalists would be thinking today: is that if they can comprise an energetic enough minority, that they can gain significant political power and influence, and then maybe they get people who are in the middle, who are easier to steer or guide to join their cause.
It is.
I do think it's very unlikely.
Yeah, it's very unlikely. But again, the ideas have a hard time dying off, so to speak. When you talked about the Bolsheviks, and in fact, the number of Bolsheviks were actually very small. Speaking from someone coming from Romania with a background in communism, having lived in a communist state and having suffered some degree of religious persecution. But of course, the idea was there, like this notion of affordability in the United States that's spreading like wildfire. Same with the Bolsheviks. They had some ideas that sort of gained currency in a very interesting period of time when historical circumstances were very favorable to the spread of those ideas. It was a war, the end of World War One. People were, angry. They were fatigued, from the war and suffering left and right,
Right.
famine and so on and so forth. And so these ideas, they were not only hungry for peace and for material things, but they were also hungry for ideas, for something new in the thinking in the heads of people. And so,
Yeah. Can I jump
go
in?
ahead.
Can I jump in real quick? So
Sure.
I just want to say,
Yeah.
I think you've really hit on something there. So I think that the greater immediate danger is of a left post-liberalism, right? Of the type you see, New York electing a socialist mayor, that sort of thing. But I also think that those kinds of things generate a reaction, a response, and that's where you would get the right post-liberalism, right? And then the kind of liberalism that we've enjoyed of limited government and freedom and democracy can end up getting squeezed out of the picture. And I want to say, you mentioned you're from Romania. Is that where Richard Wurmbrand was from? Do you know who
Yes,
I'm
sir.
talking about?
Yes, I absolutely do. Torture for Christ. Yeah,
Okay.
he lived in
Okay.
Romania. He lived in Romania, was tortured, imprisoned for about 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and then he was quote bought. The Swedes, I think, paid a ransom. They paid some money to the Romanian government to let him leave Romania, and so those were the circumstances under which he left.
Yeah, I love the story. I read his book, and I love the story of the communists have taken over in Romania, and they're holding some kind of big event, and they've invited all the pastors, and the pastors are all supposed to go along with their vision and sort of submit to them. And he's watching with his wife, and his wife says, "Richard, when will you go and wipe the shame off the face of Christ?" And he says, "If I do that, you'll lose your husband." And she says, "I thought I married a man." So what a story, right?
What a story, Dr. Baker. And I am so happy to have this conversation with you because I'm zigzagging through my mind and I'm seeing the title of your book on different platforms, book reviews, so on and so forth. And speaking of, we are sort of digressing from the topic, but that's okay. You're talking about being a man, and one of the things that you quote in one of the book reviews that I have seen is a statement from C.S. Lewis, "Men without chests." If you
Right.
don't mind, go ahead and explain that metaphor because a lot of us have read that uh, 5 line paragraph or 3 line paragraph, but few of us have the understanding in the context in which that idea came about. And men, listen closely, and ladies as well.
So it's come from Lewis's wonderful book. I think it's really one of his best, The Abolition of Man. And what that book is dealing with is you go back to Plato. I think I heard you reference Aristotle earlier. You go back to Plato, and Plato has this discussion of the sort of the diagram of the human soul, and he divides it into the head, which is the reason, the chest, which is the will, and then the stomach, which is the appetite. And so for Plato, a well ordered human being is governed by their reason, in alliance with their will to control their appetites. And so so really Plato is focused on the reason. And what Lewis does in The Abolition of Man is he focuses on the chest, because he identifies the chest as sort of where the moral sentiments reside. And so what he's doing is he's reacting against people who are arguing that our moral sentiments are just purely constructed, just arbitrary, something that has been, imposed by society. He wants to argue, no, our moral sentiments are real. There is a real moral law. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to excise, you're trying to remove the moral law from men and women. And when you do that, you leave behind the man without a chest. And a man without a chest, Lewis argues, can be manipulated easily, and that he sees the elites of society, the state perhaps, as trying to remove the moral sensibility from human beings so that they can be manipulated into any sort of action or shape that elites might want. And it shouldn't surprise anybody who knows the history of the 20th century that there were tremendous attempts to control people in exactly that way.
Precisely, precisely. Thank you for the explanation. Going back to nationalism, for the last 5 or 6 months or so, I have commuted between Houston, where I habitually reside with my legal practice, and Brussels, where I do some legal work as well. And I see these tendencies in Europe as well. At the national level, there is like a resurgence of nationalism, even in Romania, where this broadcast originates. And I'm traveling a lot nowadays. I was in Bratislava 2 weeks ago. I was in Croatia. I was in Italy. I was in France. I was in London. I was in Poland 2 times already this summer and this fall, and I do see this resurgence of conservatism and also resurgence of nationalism. And my favorite topic when I'm asked to speak is watch out, because without Christianity, without a heavy dose of Christianity, of Christian values, of the chest that you were talking about, and explained so fantastically well, nationalism is going to destroy this continent, is not going to edify it. Maybe by itself, in itself, maybe the idea is not is not pernicious, but if you sever Christianity, Christian values, the chest from the equation, the future of Europe, nationalism, nation states. People are afraid of Europe becoming a federalized system, and so that's why they cling to this notion of nationalism. And again, and I'm glad I'm not the only one. And I see in the writings that come across my desk, which I have to review for copyrights and so on and so forth. A lot of the writers, like Dreyer, now is in. I'm talking about Rod Dreyer from Louisiana. Now he lives in Europe, in Budapest, and others. They write on this topic and they emphasize the importance of Christianity as well in this resurgence of, we love our nation, we love the family, so on and so forth, values, but we have to love God as well. So, uh, interesting topic, folks. Interesting conversation with Dr. Baker. Give us likes and distribute this conversation. And if you have any questions, go ahead and post them. And Janina is welcome to present questions to us from the public if we get any. What I would like to ask Janina to do is, before we move on to the next topic, Dr. Baker, you have given a formidable interview I mentioned earlier today. You had a conversation with Dr. Watson, which was published about your book, which was published in Public Discourse. And I recommend that interview, which I think came down on the 16th of October, about a month ago. Janina, if you don't mind, go ahead and paste the link to that article on the screen so that those who are interested can read the article as well. Going on to another topic, Dr. Bacon, I appreciate again your patience with us and honoring us with your presence on this fascinating conversation. One of the topics that you discuss and we have sort of touched on very briefly is a church and state separation. Obviously, it's a phrase that's been heard around the globe. Some nations or some societies implement it or try to implement it. Some nations don't. Some civilizations or religions don't, like Islam, for instance. We talked about Catholicism as well. But tell us a little bit about what exactly is separation of church and state. People in Europe need to understand this very well as we try to rebuild this continent, this age, this generation. Why is church and state? A couple of things, if you don't mind. Tell us about the idea itself, how it originated, in what historical circumstances. I know we don't have 2 hours to discuss the topic, but briefly, how it came about, under what circumstances did evangelicals, Puritans, for instance, have, or Protestants, have any say in the development of this doctrine, and why is it important to still have it and promote it today?
Okay. What I would say is, let me first try to define it. I think that a lot of American Christians, at least, reject the idea of the separation of church and state because they misunderstand it. A lot of people think that the separation of church and state means secularism. They think it means something like the French laïcité or something like that.
Right.
That is not what I mean by the separation of church and state. What I mean is the institutional separation of the church and state. So, in other words, the church remains independent of the state. It kind of sets its own course of action, hires its own pastors, runs its own seminaries, decides who will be it determines its own doctrine, those sorts of things. Whereas in the more unified sort of situations, you end up seeing the state trying to control the church and deciding, who will run the church and using the church for its own ends. And typically, you see the church become debilitated. I don't want to insult anyone, but I would use the example of the Church of England, for example. The Church of England is a kind of a pet of the British state. It does not have prophetic power in England. There's effectively almost no pro-life movement in England, for example. And I would argue it's because in these situations where we don't have separation, and the church is basically relying on the state for its economic existence, then you end up with the church being domesticated and controlled. And we could point to many different examples of this. The Church of Sweden is another great example where this occurred. And then even after they formally ended the relationship, the church is still controlled. They argue, well, it's a folk church, and they continue to try to regulate it and what it's allowed to believe and what people can say. So I think that the record of the state churches is really bad. Whereas if you look at the Baptists in the United States, we are very vital. We are numerous. We have a very big impact on public affairs. By no means do we win all the battles, but we have a big impact. We have to be accounted for, and sometimes we do win. And so I think that there's a very strong sort in the same way that I would argue that communism doesn't work, based on the historical record. I would argue that unifying the church and state doesn't work well either. So that's kind of how I see it.
Totally agree with you, Dr. Baker, and I see the same. I would say again, in the same vein as you, we are not having a conversation that's meant to smear or label negatively other denominations, so on and so forth. But when you see what's happening to the church in Scandinavia, particularly in Sweden, where you see that the church has lost its a church without chest. C.S. Lewis talked about men without chests. Now you're talking about Protestant churches, Lutheran churches, especially in Scandinavia, the Anglican Church in the UK without a chest. Maybe that might give you the title of an article if you write something along those lines. A church without chest.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, go ahead and send me the link, and we'll translate it in Romanian and post it on my Facebook page. It's really astonishing, and it's really sad. Particularly for me, of course, I'm no longer a young person, but I have survived communism, and I saw how my father was a preacher, a Baptist minister, and so I saw how the state controlled the church. And when I see what happens in the UK or in other countries, so-called Protestant countries in Europe, I am reminded of the past where the state controlled the church. Essentially, the church became the voice of the government, of the communist state. And those like I apologize, Pastor Wurmbrand, and my dad and others that refused to cooperate with the government, not few of them ended up in the communist gulag or in prisons and so on and so forth. So, yeah, thank you. So, you touched on my next topic or idea that I would like for us to sort of expound on, and that is you're arguing in the article and then in your book that separation of church and state, religion and politics has been to our advantage. And you mentioned the Baptists, and I think we can extrapolate that argument to just about all evangelicals in the United States, Pentecostals, Brethren, Holiness Movement, a whole bunch of other evangelical groups in the United States. Why do you say, what's sort of like the empirical evidence that separation of church and state has helped evangelicals and other religious groups in the United States, even Muslims, thrive in the United States, and Jews as well? It helped them thrive in the United States.
So there's a tremendous empirical case for this. There is a sociologist named Rodney Stark. I would strongly encourage people, if they're interested in this, to read Rodney Stark. He may have passed by now, but he studied this question intensely, and what he discovered was that the more independent the churches were, and the stronger their doctrine, the more likely they were to grow. So actually, the more demands they made of their members, the greater the strength of their beliefs, the more likely they were to grow. And the opposite was also true. The more that they were just sort of a reflection of their surrounding culture, didn't really have distinctive beliefs, didn't really ask much of their members, those tended to decline. And of course, we saw that in the United States. The mainline churches, that's what we would call the less conservative sort of legacy churches in the United States. Those have all declined precipitously. Throughout maybe the latter half of the 20th century and now into the 21st. So it seems clear that a church has to be vital, or to use the biblical language, salty. The church has to be salty, right? In order to thrive.
While you're talking about, well, let's go back to the separation of church and state. I think that Baptists, particularly in the United States, where they were very vocal about separation of church and state, and I think that even the Supreme Court of the United States alluded to this historical fact in some of its rulings, especially in the 60s. What can you tell us about the historical roots of this doctrine in the United States as it came through the Baptists?
Well, when the United States begins, you do have many state churches. There had been certainly there's sort of a movement within some of the states or even the colonies to have religious liberty and to not establish or to disestablish the church. So that is something that's sort of happening. And you could look at it and you could say, well, it's because the Baptists are so convincing, or it's because Thomas Jefferson is such a genius, or something. But the reality is probably because there was religious pluralism in the United States, right? Lots of different kinds of Christians. And when you have lots of different kinds of Christians, it makes a lot of sense to allow people to be free in their choice of churches and how they worship and practice their faith. And so eventually that logic becomes a dominant logic in the United States. Now, having said that, the United States very quickly goes away from having any kind of a hard establishment. But for a long, long time, we had what I would call a soft establishment. Such that people understood this was a Christian country, right? That we're not forcing anybody to be in the church or to tithe or anything like that, but that there's a significant soft establishment and that Americans by and large saw themselves as Christians. That sensibility is not as strong as it once was, in part because of the vast sort of global pluralism of the United States, and also in part because of gains made by secularists.
Right. The United States has been a fertile ground for just about all religions that ended up in the United States, and that is thanks to the fact that initially people had this vision about pluralism, respecting each other's faith. While you were talking about the historical roots of some of these ideas, what came to mind is a book that was published earlier this year or maybe last year I think that this year uh, we commemorated, or the Germans did, 500 years since the Peasants' War in Germany. I think that they were eventually exterminated in the summer of 1525. And I do remember Dr. Baker, and maybe this is a historical fact which is fascinating, and I'm sure you know about this as well. They wrote like 12 articles or something like that, and one of them, in one of the articles, of course, the peasants, the vast majority of them were Protestants, Lutherans, and one of the things that they requested in those 12 articles was religious freedom and the right of the church to appoint its own priests or pastors, I apologize, to appoint its own bishops, its own hierarchy, the right to be independent from the state with respect to making decisions about doctrine and the faith and the baptism of children and so on and so forth. So, folks, there you have it. 500 years ago, these ideas already started to percolate in Europe, and a lot of us are beneficiaries of these very ideas, right?
Yeah. And of course, I mean, we can look at the early church. I mean, the early church is obviously not a state church.
Right.
The early church, a different situation. It lives in the world of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire. So there is one faith, which is sort of the loose faith of emperor worship, which is very formalistic, and you just kind of have to make the right gesture or say the right thing. But within that Roman sort of regime, everybody worships everybody else's gods. It's the polite thing to do. There's a wonderful book about this called I think it's called Jesus, Destroyer of the Gods, or Destroyer of the Gods, something like that. And but it does a great job of painting the picture of the early church. And the early church, the Christians are expected to worship everybody else's gods. The Romans are probably willing to include Jesus in the pantheon, if they want to. But the Christians are not like that, and they cannot even formalistically bend the knee or make the small sacrifice or whatever, and so that results in persecution, which then sort of kind of miraculously seems to come to an end with the conversion of Constantine. So maybe it's not surprising that that once Constantine makes the empire a Christian empire, that their expectation is, okay, well, now things will be the way they were before, except it will be Christian in nature, and that will be our model. And really we didn't move away from that, I would say, until the Reformation.
That's correct. One topic that also comes to mind that we have sort of touched on slightly is religious freedom. And I'm putting this topic in the context of our conversation because religious freedom is so absolutely important. It's sort of like the idea which sort of broke uh, the ice for Europe 500 years ago, or with Luther, or whenever, and in subsequent decades, which brought about so many blessings. From this very idea, religious freedom, so many other ideas were set in motion from which we benefit today. You're talking about democracy, pluralism, tolerance, and this very idea that you mentioned earlier today with respect to Europe is so much in danger. I'm here in Brussels. It's like I am in the lion's den, right? You've got to be careful about what you say about faith. You are being censored. You might be. I'm hearing horror stories in different parts of Europe where people are arrested because they proclaim the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and so on and so forth. And then you've got, I think that recently the White House put out a statement in support of Christians in Nigeria. Tell us briefly, why is religious, from the point of view of a scholar, why is religious freedom So absolutely important for any society that wants to preserve its overall freedom for its citizens.
It's a seminal idea for a lot of reasons. I mean, so what I just want to know. I mean, what could be more important than what you think about God, right? I mean,
Yeah,
if you believe in God, then so many things follow from that, right? I mean, that it can have so many impacts on the way you live your life, the way you think, um, who you marry, how you raise your children, all these sorts of things. And to be human, it seems like you should own at least that, right? That you should at least have the right to sort of your own conscience, your own beliefs about these things. But to go further out with that, it means that the government does not own you,
that's right.
right? So you might think about in the New Testament, in I want to say it's like Mark chapter 12. I could be wrong about that, where Jesus considers Caesar's coin, right? And he's asked whether he should pay taxes, and he says, "Well, whose image is on the coin? Caesar's image is on the coin." And he says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's," right? So what the implication of that is that, yeah, that Caesar has a zone of responsibility, of authority. Romans 13 tells us that God gives authority to rulers. But you add that "and to God what is God's." There are things that don't belong to Caesar, right? And I would
That's
argue
right.
that our beliefs, our fundamental commitment, that doesn't belong to Caesar. And so, that's what Richard Wurmbrand was standing for in Romania, and many other, Christian martyrs and believers throughout time.
I've got maybe two more topics that I would like to cover with you, Dr. Baker, and we appreciate your patience and your vast knowledge about these topics. One topic that's been on my mind that I talk about whenever I have the chance or I post and write is the notion of the Christian citizen. And you touch on that in the interview that you had with Dr. Watson. And I want to put this in a little bit of a context because this context is so relevant not only for the United States but also for Romania, for Hungary, for France, for the United Kingdom, for just about every nation which either now or in the past belonged to this notion or this world known as Christendom. Society has become so polarized, so polemical. It's like we cannot have polite conversations anymore. We cut one another off in conversations. We yell at one another. Sometimes you end up in the streets promoting this idea or that idea, and sometimes you might even have, some scuffles and so on and so forth. And so, what I tell people at conferences where I go, I say, take your Christians, take a step back and put on yourself, on your chest, the label Christian citizen. Thank God, still in Christendom, thanks to our tradition as Christians, we have sort of learned from the war of religions in Europe 400 years ago. Thank God, nowadays in Christian-based societies or with a Christian tradition, people that disagree, you no longer have civil wars. But if you move into the Islamic sphere, for instance, or Africa, God help you, people resolve their polarized issues with guns, killing one another, and so on and so forth. But in the world of Christianity, we don't do that. So that's why I tell people, let's take a step back and call ourselves Christian citizens. Can you please tell our audience what is a Christian citizen? The meaning of Christian next to the word citizen of this world Christian something that we owe to God? How can we improve the
Yeah,
dialogue? Go ahead, please.
there's so many things I would like to say about that. So first of all, I know I won't be able to say all of them. Um, if people are interested, they can Google my name, Hunter Baker, and then Christian statesmanship. And if you look that up, you'll see that I've done all kinds of things about Christian statesmanship. Um, but I mean, what's the first thing that the Bible tells us about human beings? The very first thing that it tells us about human beings is that we're made in the image of God. That's the first thing that we're told. The second thing, by the way, male and female, but that's another topic, right? But so we're made in the image of God, and so that indicates that human beings have this certain amount of dignity and respect that is due them, right? And that they should be treated as what they are. You know, that we are possessors of reason. We are creative. We are working together to steward and cultivate the earth. And so all of this implies that we shouldn't be kind of needlessly at war or attacking each other, but instead that we should be. The phrase I always use is that we are. It's the brotherhood and the sisterhood of men and women under the fatherhood of God, and that's how we should act. And when it comes to politics, I think that we have a real duty to treat our political rights the way that we treat any other resource that we have, right? So all of us, I think, would agree as Christians that we have to be good stewards of our money, or we have to be good stewards of our health. I think that we also have to be good stewards of our political freedom. And that means not mistreating people. It means that we inform ourselves and we engage in a respectful and a rational sort of a fashion. One of my favorite sort of political philosophers is a guy named Hadley Arks, and he argues that human beings are creatures who give and receive reasons. We give and receive reasons. We give justifications for what we think and believe, and that's sort of what we owe to each other. And that is a different sort of a thing than this kind of ugly, attacking, vicious kind of thing that we see. And another thing that I often say about this is that there's no politics exception to the gospel, right? We don't.
Right.
We can't. Oh, I'm having a political fight. None of what Jesus says matters now, right? That's certainly not the case. So I think all of that stuff is very important as we engage in politics.
Totally in agreement, and we are close to ending this conversation. And Dr. Baker, we can go on for another hour if you have the time. You have a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom here. But you mentioned something that is really close to my heart as well, and I disseminate this idea wherever I go, and I'm allowed to speak, and the context is right. Christians, and don't argue, you secularists, with us, we Christians brought into focus the notion of the uniqueness and the dignity of the human being. And that was one of the front and center arguments that you made in your conversation with Dr. Watson, and I suppose in your book as well. And in preparing some notes for today's discussion with you for the podcast, what came to mind was, and by the way, I appreciate the fact that you quoted scriptures on this podcast. Appreciate that. One of the scriptures that came to mind on this topic was Psalm 8, the second half, where David talks about the dignity of man, that God created man a little less than himself, very much like God. So that verse means you and I are equal in dignity. Me and the beggar, because Brussels has a lot of beggars, are equal in dignity. Whether or not you are pregnant, or you walk in the ways of the Lord, or you have chosen a different lifestyle, we are equal in dignity. And all of us have society needs to be based on that recognition of that fundamental fact. Is there anything else, Dr. Baker, that you would like to mention in closing? Some idea or maybe a topic that I should have covered and escaped me?
Well, I think that the idea that you were just talking about the dignity of human beings, this is one of the things that the world takes for granted that comes to us from the Christian faith. There are these sort of, we could find the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which is sort of a sterilized or sanitized version of Christian morality, and my fear is that the further we get away from the source, the further we get away from the Bible, the further we get away from Jesus, the more difficult it will be to maintain those kinds of ideas. There's a wonderful philosopher, Quaker philosopher, Elton Trueblood, and he used to talk about cut flower society. The idea being that if we go out to the garden and we look at the flowers are thriving, and we cut the flower at the stem and we take it inside the house and we put it in some water, and it will be okay for a while. But we have cut it from its sources, right? It's no longer with the life-giving soil, and it will rot and die. And I sometimes worry that our society could be like that. That we are busy depleting our sources, not renewing our sources, cutting ourselves away from our sources, and that there will be some negative consequences of that.
Dr. Baker, I thank you very, very much for your presence with us in this podcast. You have enlightened me personally. I'm sure that you have enlightened many, many people that will watch this podcast. And if you don't mind, we might again, maybe next year or so, if you publish another book, we would like to already invite you on this podcast to explain the additional ideas. What's useful about these conversations, Dr. Baker, and folks, the ones that you are watching, is it's so important to have men and women like Dr. Baker who can allocate the time to sift the ideas that are swirling around in this, to some extent, insane age. And as you were talking, Dr. Baker, what came to mind also was the verse, I think it's in first or second Chronicles, which talks about once David attained the kingship in Hebron, a whole bunch of people came to him to serve him. And one segment of the population that came to serve David were the sons or the children of Issachar. And the Bible says that those people were people who knew the times and what Israel needed to do. And so I was so excited, Dr. Baker, to have you on this podcast with us tonight, and to have people of your magnitude in our discussions on this podcast who are really the children of Issachar. You spend your time thinking, sifting ideas, and then projecting them onto the body of Christ in a manner that helps us understand. So your contribution is greatly appreciated, and we thank you very much. And in closing, I also want to thank Janina, who is spending Friday night with us away from her family. We appreciate you, Janina, as well, and we wish everybody a good weekend. Thank you, Dr. Baker, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Much appreciated.